all the questions and controversies about the Son of Man issue are vast. I remember reading an article in the late 1970s, I think, in which a scholar said that in the preceding several decades, more journal articles had been devoted to the Son of Man issues than to any other topic in New Testament studies. It may have cooled down a bit, but it's certainly been one of the hot topics. It's a mare's nest from which some scholars just simply avoid like you would a swamp. But basically, as I see it, here's the background. In the late 19th century and on into the 20th century, it became a widespread assumption that the expression, the Son of Man, was a fixed expression, fixed and well-known title, referring to a well-known eschatological figure, a kind of, who's usually understood to be a heavenly being who would come. It is thought that it's, in some sense, his nature is based on the figure of Daniel 7, who seems to be a heavenly being who appears on the clouds of heaven and comes to earth. And it was just assumed that this figure was well-known, eschatological figure, and everybody knew him as the Son of Man. The reason for that, basically, if you go into it, is that, of course, the expression is used so frequently in the Gospels and as a fixed term. And so people thought, there must be an explanation for this. And the assumption was if it's used so frequently in the Gospels, it must have been used in the Jewish background. And people went looking for confirmation of it. The crucial texts that were usually cited were 4th Ezra, where the man appears from the sea, not Son of Man, but people thought, well, that's good enough. But more valuable still was the so-called parables of one Enoch, an Ethiopic text. And there, in translations, English translations of the material, you do have the expression, the Son of Man, regularly used as in that sort of formula. But from about the late 1960s, early 1970s, from various standpoints, a growing number of scholars challenged that premise and that consensus, and I think successfully so. So that I think today pretty much everybody, major scholars, John Collins and others would admit, the expression, the Son of Man, is not attested in Second Temple Jewish tradition at all, period. The figure of Daniel 7, the one like a Son of Man, that figure is known and does appear to have been influential in some Second Temple Jewish tradition, but he's not called the Son of Man. So one of the scholars that dealt with this quite well, I think, is Morris Casey's book on tracing the history of the interpretation of Daniel 7. And he shows the figure of Daniel 7 is sometimes seen as a messianic type figure, but he's never called the Son of Man. So on the one hand, you have a figure that appears to be something influenced by or something like the figure of Daniel 7, but the expression that we have in the Gospels appears to be an innovation. It's not there. And so there are only two choices. Either it's an expression that is coined in early Christianity. Norman Perrin from Chicago back in the 60s and 70s proposed that. Or the other alternative is that it was an expression coined by Jesus as a unique kind of self-designation and is preserved in the Gospels out of respect for the way the Master referred to himself. I tend to favor that latter position.